Hello, and welcome to Counseling Clients with European Backgrounds, aka Caucasian, White Americans, or European Americans. My name is Allison Bennett, and I'm happy to be standing in the place of LaBrea, who just recently had her baby. So we want to congratulate LaBrea and her healthy little girl. And we're also grateful for LaBrea and all of her hard work that she put into our group and all the research leading up to our project. So let's get started. We're going to start off with a European pop quiz. How many countries are there in modern day Europe? 50 countries. And what percentage of the United States has European heritage? 72.4%. This is important because it's a huge part of the clients that we're going to be seeing in our everyday lives as counselors. Now, each of these 50 countries has its own pride, language, and culture that are distinct, but in the United States have become a melting pot. And the reason that's important is because if we're counseling clients with a European background, often clients don't know their European background, or they're coming from a distinct European background that they value themselves. And we want to know that as counselors. Now I'm going to hand it on over to Rachel, and she's going to talk about European demographics and how Europeans like to be identified.
Thanks, Allison. So we're going to continue with what the demographics and ethnic identifications of Europeans. And this graph is very interesting in that it shows us that Europeans like to be identified by their nationality. They don't like to be identified as Europeans alone. They like to be identified as Germans or Swedish or fill in the blank. And so the purple represents individuals who identify by their nationality alone. They don't identify as Europeans at all. The green is individuals who identify by nationality and then as European, secondary. The yellow is individuals who identify as European and then their nationality being secondary. And the blue is individuals who identify only as Europeans. And as you can see, that is the smallest group. And so this is very similar to the United States in that we don't like to be referred to as solely Americans, but Texans like to be Texans, and people from New York like to be referred to as being from New York. And so we can think about that when we think of European people. So this map shows a lot of the main European countries, and on the right you'll see the top 10 countries by population, and they have the highest population of the European countries, and so they're the most likely of places that we're going to be receiving clients. And then further on the right, the numbers in bold are the amount of immigrants from those countries. And so Germany is the highest, so that is the most likely place that we would receive clients from. But immigration happens in waves, and because of turmoil happening in that nation at a given time, such as large groups of British or Germans or French immigrating to the United States during historic events that have happened. And the most recent being in 1990 with the Eastern European countries escaping the fall of communism. And so we as a group decided to split this group of people into two categories. And the first group of people is white Americans with general or little knowledge of their heritage and cultural background. And so these are just your average white Americans who put Caucasian in the blank. And then group two is white immigrants from Europe and or family members who are direct immigrants from Europe and know their lineage and background culture. And so these images represent this very well in that they're both white males, obviously, but one is very prideful of being an American with the American flag, and the other is very proud of being European and has the Eastern Union flag on his face. And one of my classmates very thankfully mentioned that it's very identifying of Americans are very bold and his mouth is open and the other's very stoic. So that was interesting. And so example group 1, Caucasian Americans. This is the group of people that is generally identified as those who make up the melting pot of the United States. When we think about melting pot, thinking about people from all over the world, all nationalities coming in. And so this group of white Americans are the ones that don't know necessarily where they're from, or maybe it's not important to them. And so this can lead to a lot of lack of cultural influence or feelings of invisibility, which are things that we will most likely encounter in the counseling room. And then the two most seen issues within this population is often white privilege and white guilt. And Bruce is going to be presenting a case study that discusses this further.
Thank you, Rachel. We did want to talk about some of the modern issues facing Caucasian or white Americans in particular. And so two, of course, of these major issues would be white privilege and white guilt. But we also wanted to analyze and look at the division between millennials and younger versus Generation X and older, and the factor of age on these divisions. First, we want to define what these two different subjects are. White guilt being defined as the vacuum of moral authority that comes from simply knowing that one's race is associated with racism. Whites and American institutions are acknowledging historical racism and to show themselves redeemed of it. And so that's what white guilt encompasses. White privilege, on the other hand, is defined as an innate collection of favored benefits or circumstances which are not earned, that have been granted to white people who are often considered to be the mainstream in America. This is also known as an ascribed status. And so to be able to understand this further and how this is impacting Caucasian Americans today, we wanted to contrast it. Shelby Steele wrote a book called White Guilt and How Blacks and Whites Together Destroyed the Promise of the Civil Rights Era. She said this: some white people are apprised of their experiences of white privilege. They may feel badly about the intrinsic benefits they perceive that they obtain simply because they are white. And to compensate for this, they are overly sensitive, extremely aware, or excessively tolerant toward non-whites. Therefore, she says that she understands white guilt to be a phenomenon that, although real, may not be the most effective way to counterbalance the historical effects of racism perpetuated by the mainstream against those deemed to be colored. And I thought that was an interesting quote and a take on these two prevailing issues with white Caucasian Americans today, and really helped to put it into a perspective of what different groups of Caucasians are and their take on these two particular issues. Again, we wanted to touch on the fact that age has a high impact on those two particular issues. And so a Caucasian counseling consideration about age would be found in a case study of values of younger versus older Americans. Pew Research Center did this research in 2018, really in regards to politics surrounding the differences between voters and their ages who were supporting the Obama administration versus the Trump administration. And so they took these main things into consideration there. The main one being in the middle, that millennials are 59% white, whereas the older generation that they were calling the silents were 79% white. And so they were able to determine through this that the younger generations, particularly the millennials, were expressing a more liberal view on many issues and have stronger democratic leanings than do their older cohorts. And so why does this matter? Well, in our counseling with these different clients, the age of those counselor, those being counseled or those presenting, is going to tend to have a lean one way or the other. And so it's important for us to be able to understand this background with these Caucasian clients coming in, at least the generalities of understanding that those that are older are going to tend to be more conservative, and those that are younger are going to tend to be more liberal leaning. The second group that we wanted to talk about were of these white Americans are those that are direct European immigrants or refugees. That their particular presentations and counseling are going to be very different, drastically different from group one, who were more of what we were calling Caucasian Americans or just white Americans who consider themselves just Americans, that we hear often. And so for this particular group, although a minority, we did want to emphasize that it's a distinctly different group of white people that are coming from, again, directly from Europe, or their family members of those coming directly from Europe. The most important things to understand about this group are the following. Are they from Western or Eastern Europe? If they're from Western Europe, they're coming from traditionally a more wealthy background and a similar economy to America. So when they're coming over, the majority of those people immigrating to the States from Western Europe are coming because of marriage, or they're coming because of business. Those coming from Eastern Europe, a majority of them, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, were not coming for those previously mentioned reasons. They were coming as refugees, and they were escaping communism or coming out of post-communism. There's also a lot of cultural differences in those Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans as well. One of the main things to be able to understand or to investigate when these direct European immigrant clients come in is, what is their level of language acculturation? It's been said in Europe that if you speak 4 languages, you are superior. If you speak 3 languages, you're above average. If you speak 2 languages, you're average. And if you speak 1 language, you're American. And so given that most Europeans do speak multiple languages, it's still a situation that we have to address when some of those Europeans come here and English is not their first or their second language. And so especially if they're coming from Eastern Europe and from the more poverty-stricken nations or that don't have as strong of economies, they're coming here, and especially if they're coming as a refugee, their level of language acculturation is super important. They might have been highly educated in Eastern Europe, but when they got to the States, because of language difficulties, they weren't able to continue in their profession, sometimes even as a doctor or a lawyer. And so they would come here and end up in really blue collar or less level of jobs, at least at first. And so that's something that is important to take into consideration. And now Allison is going to share some of the mental health effects for these 2 groups and how they affect them differently.
Yeah, so with group 1, we often see feelings of inadequacy or incompetence and guilt and shame. Now notice these are opposite values of what we traditionally think of as maybe white American values: individualism, self-reliance, strong work ethic, and national pride. So if they're not feeling those things that we would think of as typical, they may be feeling the opposite of those things. Group 2 are European immigrants. They may be feeling grief, loss, even survivor's guilt if they have are refugees escaping from a hostile situation. They may be even feeling oppressed and unseen in their new environment. If we are counseling group 2, we specifically want to seek to understand the client through a multicultural perspective and know where they're coming from, what country of origin they represent, and if there's any recent political upheaval and what the background is there. Now, we also wanted to look at some real life examples of who might be in these groups. So one example of who might be in group 1, the Caucasian American, is what is called a Karen. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is a Karen? Well, for those of you that don't know, Karen is a term that was deemed on the internet for a closed-minded white privileged woman in their 40s or 50s who really is slightly racist, maybe even very racist, and really causes a scene at the slightest inconvenience that and really tries to use her power to belittle others. So think of someone videoing someone in public, threatening to post it on social media, asking for a manager, demanding her rights, and really causing a scene in public. Now, you may have a Karen that comes into your office who presenting problems are relationship issues with her husband, outbursts of anger at work with her children. She maybe even has trouble keeping friendships. You may be even thinking of someone in your own mind right now, of a Karen in your own life. Now, some of the things that we want to keep in mind if we do have someone with these presenting problems in our office is to help that person identify their own personal emotions and stereotypes and their biases. Even help them understand how they're interacting with their environment, how other people are experiencing them. If you have them in a group setting, you may even have to address them specifically outside of the group if they're being disruptive or causing the group to not be able to function properly. Some other things that are really helpful for someone experiencing this is figuring out, where's that anger coming from? What are some of the underlying emotions even behind that? And helping her have better coping skills, healthy coping skills whenever that anger does arise. Now, on the opposite end of that, maybe not the opposite, but on a different end of that, both in the same umbrella of the European background, we have Anna, who's a Romanian immigrant, who's maybe from the largest population of a minority from Romania, the gypsy population, traveled through an open border, a non-Spanish speaking immigrant that has gotten here illegally. And maybe has gotten into some trouble with the law and has now been court ordered into your counseling room. Anna may be presenting with problems of grief, of leaving her own country, maybe even depression. But some things to really consider are the language barrier you may have with her, even understanding, but really obviously wanting to create a safe environment for her and her client, and for your client, for her to be able to explore what's going on in her own life. Specifically, things that can be helpful when dealing with someone with a language barrier are helping them write out letters to themselves in their native language instead of having them only speak English to you, or helping them find a translator, someone that they can really feel comfortable speaking in their native language. We want to zero in on another case example. So in 1941 through 45, obviously the Holocaust was a huge event in our world history. Over 6 million Jews were killed by Nazi Germany, and Jews really fled to the United States before World War II to try to escape Nazi Germany, and then even after. And we are still seeing the effects of the Holocaust today. So according to one study, the trauma of Nazi persecution is still affecting the survivors of grandchildren. And so the teenagers in these homes reported less positive self-perceptions than their counterpart. Some of them spoke of having a hard time trusting or having the fear of getting screwed over, being suspicious, and really just having an uneasiness at home. They really mentioned having really a dark shadow over their home. So really, as we consider the effects and the ongoing ripples of the Holocaust as we counsel people, do they know their background? Are there stories of the Holocaust in their history and in their family? And we need to be aware of traces of trauma in the second and third generation, maybe even that they're unaware of, so that we can properly treat them. Now, every group has been talking about knowing our own worldview, but this is specifically important with clients from European backgrounds, because often they don't know their worldview, or they don't know their culture, their heritage, where they're coming from. Now, it's important to survey the client and understand the client's unique worldview and their proximity to the family history of the immigration to America. So are they fresh to America? Their family is just now learning the culture. Are they new? Or are they someone who maybe has no idea really even where their family came from. And how much does this matter to your client? Now, if your client struggles to identify with their European background, maybe there's a mixture of European heritages, ask them to choose a characteristic with the background culture to which they most identify. And that might be a starting place to help them figure out which culture they most connect with. And as always, it's imperative that we as counselors know our own worldview and what we're showing up with to the table. Thank you for joining us for the presentation on clients with European backgrounds. I'm Allison. This is Bruce and Rachel, and LaBrea is also part of our group. So thank you for watching. And here are our references if you'd like to check those out.